Okay, guys, so welcome to the second part of the lecture. So we let off at the end of the first part in having a little quick recap or overview of the intercultural development continuum. Yeah, so the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity from Bennett, which we also looked at in the last section. So let's move on to the second model that is very useful in dealing with intercultural competence. The next model we're looking at is what's called the developmental curve of intercultural transition. Okay, so there's lots of kind of interesting stuff in there. The idea that it's developmental again, so it's a process. The fact that it's a curve, meaning that it goes up and down, meaning that there are kind of ebbs and flows in developing intercultural competence. And I think what's quite interesting in the title here as well is the intercultural transition. Yeah, so moving from the ethnocentric monocultural point of view towards the more multicultural intercultural ethno-relative point of view. It's also known as the Kubler-Ross transition curve. Okay, so what we can see here is that on the x-axis, the vertical axis here, we have morale and competence. Yeah, so increasing morale, and by morale, obviously we mean your sense of emotional positivity, and then obviously competence, and then on the x-axis along the bottom here, and we have increasing time. So how our morale and our competence increases as time increases. So what we can see, there's kind of three main phases to the kind of the falling side of the morale before the curve starts to increase. And again, I suppose these can be aligned to some of the same stages that we talked about in Bennett's model. So what we normally do is we start with shock, yeah, and by here we mean culture shock. You find yourself in a new place. Even if you've been studying the particular language, as is the case of you guys, you've been studying the German language for quite a long time, you are still going to experience culture shock to some extent when you arrive in a German-speaking country, because quite frankly, being there and experiencing it firsthand is going to make you feel that you fully don't understand how the culture works. Moving on from culture shock, then there's often a sense of numbness. So the idea of you kind of feel as if you can't really adapt to this new kind of culture. You feel that you're fairly ineffective and you really don't know how you're going to deal with it. At that stage, then denial can kick in. And by denial, we mean here again this idea of dispensing with dealing with other cultures, not wanting to engage with intercultural learning and intercultural competence, denying the existence of other cultures and the relevance of that. That can then lead to a kind of a sense of fear, of being scared of the other culture. Are there things in that other culture that kind of unsettle you, the ways of doing things that you really don't like? That can also lead to anger. And again, we're kind of seeing here within this curve, some of these are kind of the stages of loss as well sometimes. So anger here, where you can get quite annoyed with cultural practices from the other culture or cultures that you come into contact with. And it can make you quite angry that people do things in a certain way or see things in a certain way. And this can then follow on and lead to depression, where you kind of feel, oh, I just don't want to be here anymore, and I'm really just not happy, and I miss being at home, and I miss being in a familiar culture, and I just don't, I really just am not happy in myself with this kind of situation. After that kind of bottoming out of the curve, then what we see moving towards the ethno-relative, or the kind of the intercultural side of the spectrum, then is looking at things like understanding. So, eventually, if you stick at it and you engage with the other culture, you will eventually start to understand how that other culture or other cultures work, which then can follow on and lead to an acceptance of these other cultures and other cultural patterns, other ways of doing things, different behaviors, different values. You can accept them. You can accept them alongside your existing cultural patterns. You might even move on towards integrating them into your being so that you adapt cultural patterns and values and behaviors from another culture into you and who you become. And you kind of enter into what is often called a third space, which we're going to look at in a couple of minutes. So that's the kind of the second model that we're going to look at, the Kubler-Ross transition curve, so the developmental curve intercultural transition. And then the final one, which is probably a little bit more in-depth, is this process of developing intercultural competence model. And here, what's quite an interesting one here is that there's obviously a process involved. and a development involved. But what's quite interesting in this model here is they talk about the individual level and they talk about the interactive level. So what are the various things that happen at the individual level and what are the various things that happen as a result of interaction with other people. So we start with the attitude side of things. So again, here we're talking about being respectful, yeah. So valuing other cultures and wanting to engage with other cultures, being open, yeah. So withholding judgments that we all have about other cultures and ways of doing things, and being open to seeing, well, are there other ways of doing it that could potentially be equally successful or even more successful? Curiosity and discovery, yeah. So actually being open and generally curious and interested in the other culture and the ways of doing things, the ways of behaving, and the values that they have. And then on the other side of the individual side of the spectrum, then we have knowledge and comprehension. Yeah, so here we're talking about cultural self-awareness, and we're talking about deep cultural knowledge. We're talking about sociolinguistic awareness. Now, these things are all something that you've all started to do already. So when you have started learning German as a foreign language in secondary school and now at university, you have been developing cultural self-awareness, and all of the cultural stuff that we've been doing with you in the various classes is to kind of trigger that process of understanding, your own sense of being in terms of your own culture or cultures that you embody, and how they differ from the other cultures that you guys will come into contact with. What sort of deep cultural knowledge you've developed about German speaking culture, so talking about German national culture, Austrian national culture, talk about regional cultures, that kind of thing. And then also sociolinguistic awareness. How are these cultural patterns reflected in language use? How does humor work linguistically? How does politeness work linguistically? So these kind of very kind of applied ways of doing things. And the skills that you have on this kind of individual level as well are to listen, to observe, and to evaluate. You also want to analyze, interpret, and relate. Okay, so kind of at the basic level, listen, observe, and evaluate. And then take it that step further, analyze them, interpret them in how you see the world, and relate them to how you are as a person. That then brings us on to kind of the internal outcomes. So as a result of these attitudes and as a result of this knowledge and comprehension ability, you have this kind of internal outcome where you have an informed frame of reference, which has shifted. It's shifted away from a more multicultural or monocultural approach to things towards a more multicultural or even intercultural way of doing things. So you have adaptability, flexibility, you have a more ethno-relative or intercultural view on things. You're empathetic and open to dealing with new things that you'll encounter in your lives. Then through interaction with people from those various cultures, it leads to external outcomes. And in terms of external outcomes, what you're doing is you're turning these internal features into external skills. So you are an effective and appropriate communicator, and you can behave in an interculturally appropriate way in any given situation. This then, of course, feeds back into the cycle, which then affects our attitudes, affects our knowledge, which leads to then deeper and more extensive internal outcomes, which then through interaction can lead to even more further developed and extensive external outcomes. So we kind of have a cyclical idea here to this model, and the process that occurs when developing intercultural competence. Okay. So when you are developing intercultural competence, when we look at the research literature, a very popular idea that has come forth within the last number of years is this idea of the third space. Yeah, so the third space, before we get into the kind of more theoretical stuff, quite simply is this idea that when you interact with another culture and you move through the various stages that we've looked at the moment, and you get to the idea of acceptance and integration, where you accept that cultural difference exists and that different points of view can happen and that they're equally valid, and then you start integrating that into who you are as a person, and it affects your way of viewing the world, your way of behaving, etc. You're then said to be in a third space. You're said to be in this kind of in-between space that exists between cultures. And that allows you not only to move between the cultures, but it also allows you to subjectively and objectively look at the cultures from the outside inwards. Okay, so when we're talking about the third space, we're talking about this momentary field of construction. So the third space is very much a fluid idea. It's not something that's fixed and rigid, but rather it develops within any particular moment in time when two cultures kind of come together. And it happens when the subject has constructed his or her positioning within it. By subject, we're talking about a person here. And it becomes his or her transitional third space between the cultures that are in interaction with one another. So we say this place is never durable, so it doesn't exactly exist for long periods of time and whatnot. It's very transitional and very momentary, and it's constantly in flux and developing in constant new ways due to the ongoing process of construction, so the ongoing process of cultural interaction. And this third space is the locus of intercultural competence. It is the place within which intercultural competence comes into being and exists. So by being able to position yourself objectively between two different cultures, you can develop intercultural competence. And as a result, you develop an idea of intercultural hybridity or cultural hybridity. Yeah. So this idea being that you're in between these two spaces, and as a result of being in these two spaces, you change who you are, and you can integrate aspects of the various cultures and move between the cultures more successfully. The relevance of the third space has also been discussed in German philosophy, and here we can see a quote from Waldenfels. So this is the idea being that without this space of being in between cultures, there would be no sense of any intersubjectivity and no interculturality deserving of the name. So without being able to position yourself between cultures, it wouldn't be possible to be intersubjective, or intercultural at all. There would be only the expansion and duplication of the native categories. The other would always have been already silenced. So the idea being that if you're not sitting in a third space, what you're doing then is you're sitting within one particular culture and silencing, suppressing, ignoring the other culture. So third space, being in between cultures, allows a person to be interculturally competent. So in this final part of the lecture, I just want to look at some of the, the data that has come out of studying people that are involved in moving into this kind of third space, involved in intercultural interactions on a continuous basis. So here we have an example from data where the person talks about this kind of idea of intercultural competence and being in a third space. I'm now able to look at both cultures with objectivity as well as subjectivity. I'm able to move in both cultures back and forth without any conflict. Okay, so again, this idea of moving inside cultures, moving between cultures, but also standing outside of cultures, looking at them objectively and subjectively. And then we have another one here, when we're talking about, and this study relates to American and Japanese students. I think that something beyond the sum of each identification took place, and it became something akin to the concept of synergy. When one adds one and one gets three or a little more. There's something extra. There's something extra is not culture specific, but something unique of its own, probably the emergence of a new attribute or new self-awareness, born out of an awareness of the relative nature of values and of the universal aspect of human nature. Yes, the idea being that when you are in a third space and you are moving in between, into and out of two cultures, that there is this extra space that exists, this kind of synergy, where two cultures come together. It isn't just the two cultures, that there's this third space that exists. And this allows you to generate new attributes and new self-awareness of exactly who you are within any particular point in time. And if we look at the Irish context, there's been some research done by a colleague in IT Tralee. And one of the respondents in her study very interestingly talked about German, very specific to the German culture and German context of the year abroad, when she said I would say at the end of the year abroad, I could be part of the German culture and do things the German way, but my values and opinions were still essentially Irish. But I feel like I lost a bit of my Irishness abroad, and I feel that I became a bit more neutral. Like here is German and here is Irish, and I landed somewhere in the middle. So here she talks very specifically about being within this third space. Okay, guys, so that's everything for this week. I hope it's all relatively understandable, and I look forward to giving you guys the next lecture soon. See you.